Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to give you 10 recommendations for the r/fantasy bingo hard mode prompts. For those of you who don't know, the subreddit for speculative fiction r/fantasy every year create a bingo card. Now this starts in April and runs through to the following April, and what this consists of is 25 prompts for books. Whenever you read a book that fits one of these prompts, you can tick it off of your bingo card, and the aim is to fill out all 25 prompts by the end of the year, so by next April. This is meant to encourage us to read things that might not be in our normal comfort zone, things that we wouldn't normally look at because they're a little bit different, or force us to at least think about what we're reading a little bit more, and I really enjoyed it. I did it for the first time last year in 2021, and now in 2022, I'm going to give you some recommendations for hard mode. So for hard mode, the prompts have a slight additional requirement that might restrict the books even more, might give us a different flavor to the prompt. But yeah, I am going to give you 10 recommendations for some of the hard mode prompts here on Fantasy Bingo for this year. I didn't just want to give you recommendations for every single prompt. I wanted to give you recommendations where I felt I had a really good solid book for that prompt that maybe isn't too well known, that might be a new book to you and might encourage you to pick up something that you've not heard of or read before. So let's jump in. So the first one I want to talk about is the second row down. It's the first column, and this is standalone. So this is books that have no sequels, no prequels. They don't have any shared universe worlds or books. They don't have any novellas or companion short stories. This wants to be a true standalone. The hard mode restriction for this is that it's not on r/fantasy's favorite standalones list. So I had a little scroll through that list, and my favorite fantasy standalone that is not on that list is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Now, her other well-known fantasy work, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, is on that list, but Susanna Clarke's Piranesi is not on that list. It is a wonderfully interesting standalone story. We follow this character known as Piranesi, and he lives in this house. It is a house of classical Roman and Greek style architecture that has a flood, a tide that flows through this house on different days and at different times. And Piranesi is basically the only person we follow, and they only have one other character that they meet in this world that they see semi-regularly. I don't want to give you too much information here because the wonderful part of this is discovering the world and discovering the story as you go. It is told in an epistolary format in Piranesi's diary, in her journal. I don't want to give you too many other details than that, other than it's a very interesting, short fantasy standalone that will fulfill the hard mode criteria here for standalones. My next recommendation is for the fourth prompt on that second row, and this is called Cool Weapon. So let me read that to you. At least one main character uses a weapon with magical properties, so that's cool. And the hard mode is the weapon has a unique name, and it gives us some examples, okay? So my recommendations here, I've got some obvious ones and I've got a slightly more obscure one. So initially, anything written by Brandon Sanderson. So Warbreaker is a perfect example of this, or the Stormlight Archive series, perfect example. They all have names as well, so it fulfills hard mode criteria. But my recommendation for you is going to be any of the books from the Lycanius trilogy. So this starts with The Shadow of What Was Lost, and then An Echo of Things to Come, and then The Light of All That Falls. It is written by James Islington. It is very much in the style and the vein of a Brandon Sanderson book. It is James Islington's debut trilogy. I think it's really good so far. I have read the first 2 books of this. I'm just starting the 3rd book at the moment, and I have a good opinion of it. I think the second book slowed down a little bit, but there is definitely a very cool fantasy weapon here, magical weapon, and it is named as well, so we can have our hard mode criteria ticked off for this one. And then the next prompt on this same row, immediately next to this, is a book featuring a revolution. Any overthrowing of governments, monarchs, and systems will do. The hard mode is the revolution/rebellion is the main focus of the plot. So 2 things I want to recommend for you here. The first one of them is going to be a recent release. It's called Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky. It is a novella, so you might not want too many novellas on your bingo card, but if you've got space for a novella, here you can go with Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky, a very well-told second-person narrative about standing up to the landlords and the masters. As well as that, I would highly recommend the Red Rising saga, particularly the Red Rising trilogy, the first 3 books, which are very focused on rebellion and revolution. Again, both of these fit that hard mode criteria. For the slightly more obscure, you might want to go Ogres, but like I said, it is a novella. The next one I want to talk about is the first prompt on the third row, and this one is name in the title. A character's first name appears in the title. And then the hard mode is the title has the character's first and last name. So my recommendation here for hard mode, if you haven't read it, is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I had mixed feelings on The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I have a review for it on my channel from a long time ago, so the quality is probably pretty poor. I apologise for that. But it is an interesting take on fantasy. We follow our main titular character, Addie LaRue, and she is cursed with people forgetting her. She is super forgetful. People do not remember her. She could meet people 100 times, and every single time that they meet, the person would think it was the first time. It is an interesting fantasy. I think it's set in 18th century France. All in all, I didn't love it. I had a few issues with plot holes, or what I perceived as plot holes. But if that's something that might not bother you too much, this is an interesting option for this hard mode prompt. Next up, we're going for set in Africa. So any fantasy or sci-fi set in Africa or an African analogue. African-inspired world or nation, and here the hard mode is an author of African heritage. So here I haven't looked into Evan Winter's background hugely, so I'm assuming a little bit here. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, but Evan Winter's The Rage of Dragons is a wonderful African-inspired fantasy that I have read very recently and I really, really enjoyed. It is massively about revenge and about retribution. I'm just going to say justice, but yeah, a little bit justice. But we are following Tao, who's an interesting, if angry, main character. Often people characterize him as a little bit dumb, making poor decisions, but I think that is a very understandable trait in Tao considering what's going on. All in all, very heavy military fantasy. So if you like military fantasy, this could be one that fits this prompt really, really nicely for you. Moving on to the fourth row, and the first prompt on the fourth row is a non-human protagonist. So the main character must not be human or partially human. Humanoid aliens or anthropomorphic animals do count, okay? Now the hard mode makes this a lot harder. Non-humanoid protagonist. No elves, angels, dwarfs, hobbits, or humanoid aliens. So my recommendation here is a book by Adrian Tchaikovsky again, and it is one of my favourite, if not my favourite Tchaikovsky book. And this is Dogs of War, in which we follow Rex, who is a bioform. He is a genetically engineered dog, and he works for a military organization. It is very well written. I love the perspective of Rex. I think he's really interesting, and he doesn't think like a human, which I think fits the spirit of this prompt as well as the written words of this prompt really nicely. His other bioforms in his pack are also non-human in very interesting ways. They're a very diverse cast in this set of bioforms, and I absolutely love Dogs of War. I really enjoy the second book, Barehead, as well. I don't think that fits this prompt quite as well, but I absolutely love Dogs of War, and I would recommend that as this for a hard mode answer to this prompt. Next up is the 5 science fiction or fantasy short stories. This is a common recurring prompt on Bingo as far as I can tell. The hard mode is to read an entire collection or anthology. Last year I read Ted Chiang's Exhalation and absolutely loved it. This year my recommendation for you is actually a book I haven't read, but I have just finished a related novel in the same world by this author, and I loved it, and I will definitely be using this for my prompt this year. And this is Neon Leviathan by T.R. Napper. So this is a collection of short stories, I think 12 of them, set in the same world as 36 Streets, which I've just read and loved. So they're cyberpunk short stories, 12 of them to fill out this collection, and I am really excited to get to it. It got released a couple of years ago in 2020, and is absolutely what I am going to be reading. There are plenty of other options for you if you want to read something else for that prompt as well. So next up is what might be the hardest hard mode prompt on this list, and it is self-published or indie publisher. So self-published or published through a small indie publisher, fine. Hard mode, self-published and has fewer than 100 ratings on Goodreads. Or an indie publisher that's done an AMA with r/fantasy. So my recommendation here, get it while it's hot because it is at 79 ratings on Goodreads currently. So you want to read it quick so it counts for you. This is Seasons of Albaddon, a wonderful self-published fantasy work by Christopher Warman and Alain Marché. I read this in 2021 and absolutely adored it. It is a novel that is basically 4 novellas stitched together, but they're set in the same world. They are set one season after another, and they are done really well. I think the overarching ideas of the world and the plot is great. I absolutely adore the character work in this. There are some characters in this that I still think about today, even though their story was maybe 40, 50 pages long, and I just absolutely love it. Far more people need to read The Seasons of Albaddon. I highly recommend it. Go and check it out quick before too many more people rate it, and it's not good for this hard mode prompt any longer. So the penultimate prompt I want to talk about is the second prompt on the bottom row, and this says, the author must be black, indigenous, or a person of colour. The hard mode, a book written by an indigenous author. So my suggestion here is a book I read this year by a Native American author, and this is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is paranormal, I would say horror, really interesting. It is written by a Native American about Native American people. It follows 3 different Native American men who are basically dealing with a traumatic experience from their past and are trying to move on, but there is something that is not allowing them to. And I don't want to give you much more information than that, but I think this gave me a really interesting view into Native American culture. It's not a culture I'm very aware of as a British person, and I really like the way that Stephen Graham Jones introduced me into some aspects of that culture. Would highly recommend this if you enjoy horror or creepy, paranormal urban fantasy, but definitely on the horror side of things. Yeah, great book, definitely recommend from me. And my last recommendation for you is one that I didn't think would be that hard, but once I started looking, actually is not very easy. So it's called No Ifs, Ands or Buts. So the title does not include the following words. Oh, this doesn't work. I've just read this properly. Give me a second, I'm going to find us another one. So I did not realise that the word "the" was included on this, which has absolutely destroyed my original recommendation. Let me read this again with my new recommendation for you guys. So, no ifs, and or buts. The title does not include the following words: the, a or an, and or if of but. Okay, so you don't think that's going to be that difficult. It is really hard. So my original recommendation was going to be, when I didn't realise the word "the" was included, was The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams, the first book of the Winning Flame trilogy. Absolutely love it. That now doesn't work for this, so I apologise. The hard mode is the title has 3 words or more. That makes this super difficult, okay? So 3 words or more, not using the, a, an, and, of, or, if, but. That's really hard. Now, my suggestion here is going to be what I am going to be reading for this prompt, I believe. And it is actually something that you might need to have read some other stuff beforehand, okay? So if you have read the First Law trilogy and you've never moved on from there, I would suggest the next book to read is one of the standalones, and it is called Best Served Cold, which is a brilliant title. Really like what I've heard about this. Apparently it's very much a revenge story. I'm very excited. I can imagine the character we're following, but we'll have a see when we get to it. But if, like me, you have read the First Law trilogy but never got any further, time to move on with Best Served Cold would be my suggestion for hard mode. Let me know down below any other recommendations you have for hard mode prompts that you think would be good to read for those. And if you want to see more of my content, there should be a video up here. You can go check that out. And I'll see you guys again soon.